July of 1572. The dust of the steppe rises on the horizon like a storm cloud. But it is not a storm. It is something much worse. From the south, from across the vast golden plains of Crimea, from the tinted camps of the most feared military force in the known world, a tide of 120,000 warriors is moving north. They ride in columns so wide and so deep that the horizon itself seems to shift and tremble. The sound reaches ahead of them like a tremor in the earth, hooves hammering the dry summer ground, iron clinking against iron, war cries in a dozen languages that carry on the wind like the promise of death. Above them, the sky fills with the kind of dust that only a horde creates. Not a cloud, not a storm, an army. Moscow knows they are coming. Moscow has known for weeks. And Moscow remembers. It has been barely 12 months since this same force descended on the city and reduced it to cinders. 80,000 people were slaughtered or dragged off in chains to the slave markets of Constantinople. The largest city in the northern world burned for 3 straight days. When the fires finally died, only the stone walls of the Kremlin still stood, rising from a black sea of ruin and ash that stretched in every direction as far as a man could see. A year later, the smell of that fire still lingers in the timbers of the rebuilt districts. The mothers of Moscow have not stopped flinching at shadows. The priests have not stopped praying. The soldiers sharpen their blades in the mornings and check them again at night, and their hands do not stay steady when they do it. Every soul in this city understands the arithmetic of what approaches. The Crimean horde does not leave rubble behind it. It leaves silence. Leading this tide is Devlet Giray, Khan of Crimea. He is a direct heir of the Golden Horde, a vassal of the Ottoman Sultan, and a man with a mission that goes far beyond plunder. His purpose this summer is not tribute. It is not negotiation. It is the complete and permanent erasure of Russia from the map of the world. He has said so explicitly, in letters to his Ottoman masters, and in the message he sent to the Russian Tsar after last year's burning. Next year I will return, and this time I will not leave until Russia is ashes and the Tsar is dead. He has assembled the largest army the horde has fielded in living memory, riding with his cavalry, 4,000 Ottoman Janissaries, the finest professional soldiers on earth, and bronze artillery pieces that can bring down stone fortresses. The full weight of 2 empires is pointed at a single city, and the road to that city is open. And yet there is one man inside Moscow who is not trembling. Ivan IV, the first Tsar of all Russia, the man history will call Ivan the Terrible, spent the long Russian winter building something that has never existed before. Something he is betting the survival of his entire nation on. A walking city of wood and iron, mounted on wheels, bristling with muskets and cannons, capable of moving across the open steppe and then stopping to become an impenetrable fortress wherever it is needed. He calls it the Gulyai Gorod, the walking city. The question is whether 25,000 soldiers, behind a wall of wood and willpower, can stop 120,000 riders of death. The answer will be carved into history with cold steel and black powder in a river valley called Molodi. To understand what Molodi means, you have to go back 3.5 centuries to the moment Russia stopped being free. In 1237, Battle Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself, descended on the Russian principalities with a force that contemporaries could barely describe without reaching for biblical language. Principality after principality crumbled. Kiev fell. Vladimir fell. Moscow fell. Ryazan fell. The Mongol cavalry moved so fast and struck so hard that organized resistance was impossible. In their wake, they left pyramids of skulls outside the ruins of cities that had taken generations to build. What followed the conquest proved, if anything, worse than the conquest itself. The yoke began. For over 2 centuries, 240 years, Russian princes knelt before the Khan. They traveled to the Mongol court to beg for the right to rule their own lands, kowtowing before men who treated them as servants. Gold, silver, furs, and slaves flowed south every year without exception. This was not occasional tribute that might be negotiated or reduced. It was a permanent state of vassalage, a tax paid in treasure and in blood, without end and without appeal. The most devastating element was what the Mongols called the blood tribute. Noble Russian sons, boys from the families of princes and military commanders, were seized as hostages and raised in the Khan's court. They were taught to speak Mongol. They were taught to forget their language, their faith, the names of their people. Some were enrolled in the Mongol military. Some married into Mongol families. Those who returned to Russia were hollow versions of the boys who had been taken, their Russian identities scraped away and replaced with something alien. Those who never returned were simply gone, absorbed into an empire that stretched from China to Poland. Any prince who dared to resist learned the lesson immediately and permanently. Entire cities were unmade as examples to the others. The Mongols were expert practitioners of terror as policy. They understood that the death of one city prevented the resistance of 10 others, and they applied this logic with cold mathematical precision across the Russian landscape for generation after generation. The technical end of the yoke came in 1480, when Ivan III, the grandfather of the Ivan we are concerned with, refused to pay the tribute at the Great Standoff on the Ugra River. The two armies faced each other across the water for weeks. In the end, no blow was struck, and the weakened remnant of the Golden Horde simply withdrew. Russia was, technically, free. But the heirs of the Golden Horde still existed, and they still believed Russia belonged to them. The Khanate of Kazan sat to the east, controlling the Great Volga trade route. The Khanate of Astrakhan controlled the lower Volga and the Caspian approaches. And the most dangerous successor state of all, the one with the deepest resources, the most powerful patrons, and the most ferocious military tradition, the Crimean Khanate, sat on its peninsula above the Black Sea and continued raiding Russian territory as though the yoke had never ended at all. For the people who lived in the southern and eastern borderlands of Russia, it had not. The raids never stopped. The slave markets never closed. This is the world Ivan IV was born into, and the world he was determined to end. Born in 1530 into a court already soaked in conspiracy, Ivan's childhood was a laboratory for the creation of a particular kind of man. His father died when Ivan was 3 years old. His mother, who served as regent during his early years, was almost certainly poisoned by rival boyar noble families when Ivan was 8. From that moment, he grew up inside the Kremlin surrounded by schemers who used the child grand prince as a pawn in their intrigue. Uease and treated him with contempt when it suited them. He watched men who smiled at him in the mornings plot against his position by evening. He watched power exercised carelessly by people who had not earned it. He cataloged every humiliation, every slight, every face that smiled at him falsely. He did not forget a single one. At 16, Ivan did something that nobody around him anticipated. He was supposed to be crowned Grand Prince of Moscow, continuing the established tradition of his dynasty. Instead, he demanded a different ceremony entirely. He had himself crowned Tsar, the Slavic word derived from Caesar, the title of the Roman emperors. He was not merely claiming the throne of Moscow. He was claiming the mantle of Rome itself. He was declaring himself equal to any emperor alive and placing himself in a lineage of world historical rulers stretching back to antiquity. The boyars who had treated him as a pawn stood in the cathedral and watched a 16-year-old boy redefine the entire political meaning of Russia. Then he spent the next 2 decades proving the claim was not empty. In 1552, Ivan personally led the siege of the Khanate of Kazan, the successor state that sat astride the Volga and had raided Russian territory for a century. His military engineers dug tunnels under Kazan's ancient walls and packed them with enormous quantities of gunpowder. The explosion brought the fortress to its knees. Kazan fell. Ivan celebrated by commissioning the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square. Those extraordinary multicolored onion domes that still define Moscow's skyline are Ivan's monument to that victory. For years later, in 1556, Astrakhan fell as well. Russia now commanded the entire length of the Volga River, the great artery of Eastern European trade, from headwaters to the Caspian Sea. Russia was no longer a scattered collection of frightened principalities hiding behind timber walls and prayers. It was an empire in motion. The darkness that followed is the part of Ivan that history has not forgotten and will not allow to be forgotten. In 1560, his beloved first wife Anastasia died. Ivan was convinced, and the circumstantial evidence does support his suspicion, that she was poisoned by the boyar noble families who had always resented his authority. The loss broke something in him that never healed. In 1565, he created the Oprichnina, a state within the state. 6,000 black-clad riders mounted on black horses, carrying brooms and dog skulls on their saddles as symbols of their mission, to sweep out traitors and bite them to death. They had total license to torture, to execute, and to seize the property of anyone they designated as an enemy of the Tsar. Ivan killed with his own hands. The terror was real and it was extensive, and this is the Ivan that history remembers, rightly and without apology. But there is a second Ivan that history has been slower to reckon with, and without this Ivan, Molodi never happens. This Ivan established Russia's first printing press, bringing literacy and the transmission of ideas out from behind monastery walls. This Ivan rebuilt the Russian military from the ground up, creating the permanent Streltsy musketeer regiments that would form the professional corps of the army at Molodi. This Ivan pushed Russia's borders east of the Ural Mountains and began the conquest of Siberia that would eventually make Russia the largest territorial state in human history. And most critically, this Ivan grasped something that his contemporaries, both Russian and foreign, largely did not. He understood that technology and strategy, properly applied, could defeat raw numbers. He understood that the age of the steppe nomad could be ended by an army disciplined enough to stand still and fire guns. This insight is the foundation upon which Molodi is built. To appreciate the achievement of 1572, you must first understand how close to the end Russia actually was in 1571. In the spring of that year, Devlet Giray rode north with 40,000 riders, fast, deliberate, bypassing every garrison that Ivan's commanders had positioned to intercept him. Ivan had made a fatal error. He had trusted incompetent commanders, and he had split his forces in response to intelligence that proved to be deliberately misleading. When the true scope of Devlet's movement became clear, it was too late to concentrate. On May 24, 1571, the Tartar vanguard reached Moscow's outskirts and put the wooden suburbs to the torch. The wind turned the fire into something that could not be controlled or fought. Within hours, all of Moscow was a single roaring bonfire. The streets became channels of fire. Buildings collapsed inward, trapping thousands. The heat was so intense that soldiers and civilians running for the river were burned alive before they reached the water. Others crowded onto bridges that then caught fire beneath their feet. Tens of thousands more were hunted through the surrounding countryside by Tartar cavalry and chained for the slave markets of Kaffa and Constantinople. When the smoke cleared 3 days later, 80,000 people were dead or enslaved. The great city of the north had been reduced to charred earth and scattered stone foundations. Only the Kremlin stood, its stone walls having resisted where everything else burned. Devlet Giray rode home with 150,000 captives in chains and the conviction that Russia was finished as a serious military threat. He sent his famous message to Ivan: "Next year I will return, and this time I will not leave until Russia is ashes and the Tsar is dead." He was not engaging in rhetorical excess. He meant it precisely. He and his Ottoman patrons had identified the moment. Russia was reeling, its army shattered by the disaster, its capital in ruins, its population in terror. The window for final destruction was open, and in 1572 he intended to step through it. Ivan was furious, he was humiliated, and above all he was cornered. He knew Devlet Giray kept his word. He knew that 1572 would not be another raid. It would be the final verdict on whether Russia would continue to exist as a state, or whether it would be absorbed back into the Horde's world as a collection of tribute-paying remnants with no independent existence. There would be no second survival through luck or the weather or the enemy's decision to withdraw. The next time, the enemy would not withdraw. The winter of 1571 to 1572 was the most consequential season in Russian history. Ivan's first move was to clear house. Every commander who had failed in 1571 was removed. Some were publicly executed as a message to the remaining officer class about the price of failure. Others disappeared into monasteries, which in 16th century Russia was a polite way of removing someone from power without having to deal with them directly. In their place, Ivan appointed Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky, the sharpest military mind in the Russian Empire. Vorotinsky was not a court favorite or a political appointment. He was a veteran of the Kazan campaigns, the man who had seen how gunpowder and fortification could defeat a fortress that cavalry could not take in open battle. More critically, he had spent years as a Tartar prisoner, inside their world, watching how they thought and how they organized and how they fought, and, most importantly, where their method of war was vulnerable. He understood the Horde from the inside. When Ivan handed him absolute authority, every soldier, every coin from the imperial treasury, every resource the empire could mobilize, Vorotinsky understood exactly what he was being asked to do, and he began doing it immediately. The recruitment problem was stark. Vorotinsky summoned every noble who owed military service. He mobilized every Streltsy musketeer regiment. He armed peasants and paid Cossack mercenaries from the steppe to join the force. Men with a generational grudge against the Tartars that made them ferocious fighters who needed little persuasion. After every possible effort, the final count was between 20 and 25,000 men. Against 120,000, a ratio approaching 5-to-1. In open steppe, where Tartar cavalry could breathe freely and maneuver at will, that ratio was a death sentence. The only way to survive was to refuse to fight on those terms. Vorotinsky needed to change the battlefield itself. The Gulyai Gorod, the walking city, had existed in primitive form during the Kazan campaigns. Soldiers had carried large wooden shields as arrow protection during sieges, grouping them together to form temporary barriers. What Vorotinsky envisioned was something on an entirely different scale, something that had never been attempted before in the history of Russian warfare. He designed modular wooden wall sections, each 3 meters tall, built to be transported on wheels or sleds across open terrain. The sections were reinforced with additional planking and, at the most critical points, with iron plating to resist artillery fire. The revolutionary feature was the loopholes, cut at staggered heights throughout the length of the walls, each one sized precisely to accommodate either a musket barrel or a falconet cannon. When the full system was assembled, it created nearly 1 kilometer of continuous mobile wall, a fortress that could be moved to wherever the battle needed to be fought, then locked into position and turned into something impenetrable. The tactical logic was devastating in its simplicity. The entire war-making power of the Crimean Horde rested on 2 pillars: mobility and psychological terror. The ability to sweep in, fire, and disappear before the enemy could respond. The ability to induce panic, to make men run, and then to run them down. The Gulyai Gorod stripped both pillars away simultaneously. Musketeers could fire through the loopholes in complete safety, reloading behind solid cover and firing again, indefinitely. The Tartars could not flank a wall that was anchored by a river and squeezed by forest. They could not make the enemy panic and abandon their position, because the walls were there precisely to prevent that abandonment. What they faced instead was a hedgehog of wood and iron that their horses could not break and their arrows could not penetrate. The Horde's method of war, refined over 3 centuries and proven against every opponent it had ever faced, had no answer for this. The site selection for the engagement was equally deliberate. 60 kilometers south of Moscow, directly astride the natural invasion corridor from Crimea, the path any army marching from the south had to take, lay a stretch of terrain called Molodi. Small rivers and streams cut across the ground in ways that broke up wide cavalry formations. Dense forest pressed in on both flanks, eliminating the room that the Horde's great sweeping envelopments required. Low hills gave Russian artillery elevated firing angles over the surrounding ground. And the decisive geographic detail: the Pokra River ran directly behind the chosen position, providing unlimited fresh water and a completely protected rear approach that could not be attacked. But the trap needed bait. Vorotinsky sent a vanguard of roughly 3,000 Russian and Cossack cavalry forward to play the role of a small, frightened, retreating force. Their job was not to fight seriously. Their job was to provoke the Horde, to sting them, to inflict losses that demanded a response, and to pull the entire Tartar army north toward Molodi like a baited hook. Every kilometer the Horde advanced in pursuit of what appeared to be a broken and retreating enemy was another kilometer deeper into the trap. The main army waited behind the assembled Gulyai Gorod, patient, hidden, and silent. Vorotinsky spent months drilling his men in the mechanics and the psychology of what he was asking them to do. The Gulyai Gorod could be assembled at speed in field conditions. Muskets could be loaded and fired under simulated pressure without breaking formation. Positions could be held under sustained attack. He gave his soldiers one rule above all others: No matter how many Tartars come, no matter how terrifying the charges, stay inside the walls, shoot, reload, and shoot again. This sounds simple. Against 120,000 screaming cavalry, it is the hardest thing a human being can be asked to do. Vorotinsky understood Hat the wall only worked if the men behind it believed in it absolutely. The training was not primarily about mechanical skill. It was about building a state of mind that would not break. It is necessary to take the enemy seriously. The victory at Molodi carries its full historical weight only if the threat is understood to be genuine and overwhelming, which it was. Devlet Giray was born around 1512, a direct descendant of Genghis Khan through the Crimean branch of the dynasty. He had spent his entire adult life consolidating the Khanate's power, eliminating rivals, and building an ironclad relationship with the Ottoman court in Constantinople. He was not simply a tribal chieftain commanding raiders. He was a sophisticated political actor managing one of the most complex geopolitical relationships of his era, the alliance between Crimea and the Ottoman Empire that made the Khanate genuinely dangerous rather than merely troublesome. The Khanate's primary economic foundation was human beings. Tens of thousands of Slavic slaves passed through the markets of Kaffa every year, captured in raids on Russia, Poland, and Lithuania, and sold into the Mediterranean world through Ottoman trading networks. This was not a side industry. It was the economic engine that funded everything else, and Devlet Giray was its chief executive. He wanted more than continued prosperity, though. He wanted his name written beside Batu Khan's in the chronicles of history. After burning Moscow in 1571, he was closer to that ambition than he had ever been in his life. Sultan Selim II gave Devlet his formal blessing for the 1572 campaign and backed that blessing with tangible military support. For 1,000 elite Janissaries, modern bronze artillery pieces, and experienced military advisors from the Ottoman army. The strategic calculation in Constantinople was clear. If Devlet succeeded, the Ottoman Empire's shadow would extend from the Mediterranean north to the Ural Mountains, encircling Poland, Lithuania, and the remaining independent states of Eastern Europe. Russia's elimination as an independent power would reshape the entire balance of the continent. The Mursas, the Tartar warrior nobility, were raised from birth in the saddle, trained from childhood to fire a compound bow at full accuracy while riding at full gallop. The core tactical system was feint and envelopment, clouds of mounted archers sweeping in toward an enemy formation, loosing volleys, and dissolving back before the enemy could respond. Repeat until the formation breaks. Then the heavy cavalry charge finishes what the arrows began. This method had shattered Polish knights, Lithuanian armies, Hungarian formations, and Russian forces across 3.5 centuries of continuous warfare. It had made the steppe world's greatest military system. The Ottoman Janissaries added what cavalry alone could not provide: professional musket-armed infantry capable of assaulting fixed positions with iron discipline, supported by artillery that could bring down stone walls. Together, the two forces made a combined arms team of genuine sophistication. The cavalry provided speed, encirclement, and the ability to deny the enemy any avenue of escape. The Janissaries and artillery provided the means to crack any prepared position the cavalry identified. Equally important was what Devlet's army did not need: a supply train. Each warrior carried dried meat and fermented mare's milk for personal sustenance. Horses grazed on the march. The army covered 100 kilometers in a single day without straining its logistics. No European force, no standing army of any kind, could match that speed across the open steppe. And before any of this even came into contact with the enemy, there was the weapon that had always won half of every battle before a blow was struck: terror. The word horde had been enough to empty cities for 300 years. The psychology of invincibility was as important to the horde's operational method as its bows and horses. Vorotinsky knew all of this. He had lived inside it as a prisoner. He had thought carefully about every element of it during the long winter of preparation. And he had designed a system specifically intended to take each one of those advantages and render it useless. Late July, 1572. The trap is set. The Gulyai Gorod stands assembled on the heights above the Pakra River. 25,000 Russians wait behind its walls, listening to the ground begin to tremble. On July 26th, The Tatar vanguard brushed against Russian screening forces near the Oka River. There was a brief, sharp clash, after which the Russians pulled back in apparent disorder. Devlet smiled. This was what he expected. He had burned their capital a year ago. They were afraid. On July 27th, the main Horde army crossed the Oka River. Moscow was 60 kilometers away. He rested his warriors, wanting them sharp for what lay ahead. Over the next 2 days, the Russian cavalry continued its seemingly cowardly retreat, harassing the flanks with small raids and dissolving back into the forest before a real pursuit could form. Every kilometer the Horde advanced, they went deeper into ground they did not know, surrounded by terrain that worked against them, drawn forward by men who appeared to be running. On the first day of serious contact, Tatar reconnaissance spotted the Gulyai Gorod for the first time. The commanders were confused. This was nothing like a conventional fort. It was a wall standing in a field, apparently unconnected to any natural feature, extending for nearly a kilometer. They could not leave it intact in their rear. A mobile Russian army behind them on the road to Moscow was a threat to every line of withdrawal and resupply. Devlet ordered a full assault. 10,000 riders came in the first wave, loosing arrows as they closed the distance. The shafts thumped into the wooden walls and stopped there, harmless. At 50 meters, the Russian musketeers fired. The front rank of the Tatar charge disappeared in smoke and blood. Those behind stumbled over the falling bodies of the riders ahead. Wave after wave came, and wave after wave produced the same result. The riders could not close the gap. They could not scale the walls. Their fire arrows failed. The wood had been deliberately soaked and reinforced against exactly this contingency. By the end of the first day, roughly 1,000 Tatars lay dead in the ground in front of the Gulyai Gorod. Russian losses were fewer than 100, but the psychological blow was more significant than the arithmetic. The Horde's entire tactical system had been made useless in a single afternoon. On the second day, Devlet moved the Ottoman artillery into position overnight and opened fire at dawn. A dozen bronze cannons hammered the walls and sent splinters flying like shrapnel through the air. Russian artillery answered shot for shot. 2 Ottoman cannons were destroyed. The remainder were pushed back to safer distances. Then came the main assault, 4,000 Janissaries advancing in tight professional formation, with 20,000 Tatar riders massed behind them waiting to pour through any breach. The Janissaries were genuine professionals. They held their formation under fire, reached 100 meters, halted, and delivered a coordinated volley that tore through sections of the Russian defense. Then they charged with bayonets, desperate, brave, and briefly successful. Some reached the walls. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted at the top of the wooden ramparts. Vorotinsky surged reserves to the breach immediately. Russian soldiers fought at the parapet with pikes and point-blank musket fire while, below, the falconet cannons fired grapeshot directly into the cluster of Janissaries pressing at the base of the wall. Hundreds were torn apart in seconds. The survivors broke and ran. The Tatar cavalry behind them, suddenly stripped of infantry support, charged into open Russian fire and died in heaps. By the end of the second day, 3,000 Tatar and Ottoman warriors were dead, including nearly 1,000 Janissaries, the finest soldiers the Ottoman Empire could put in the field. Russian losses were approximately 400. The wall held. On the third day, Devlet changed tactics. No more mass charges. He ordered continuous rotating attacks around the clock, cycling his men so that pressure on the Russian line never completely stopped. West flank at dawn, east flank 2 hours later, the center before midday, then west again. The attacks never paused. The defenders could not rest. They fired, reloaded, and fired again until their shoulders were bluey, said black, and their musket barrels glowed from accumulated heat. Their ears bled from the sustained thunder of continuous combat. Vorotinsky had anticipated this contingency. He ran a rotation of his own, cycling fresh units to the wall every few hours so that no section fought beyond its physical limit. But the pressure was immense, and it was relentless. Inside the Tatar camp, something was cracking. Warriors who had ridden out expecting easy plunder and swift victory were watching their brothers die against wooden walls that would not break. The Mursas, the warrior nobility who formed the fighting core of the Horde, began to say quietly among themselves what none of them could afford to say out loud. The Horde supplies were thinning rapidly. Vorotinsky had ordered every village within foraging range evacuated weeks before the battle began. There was nothing left to take. Late on the third afternoon, Devlet committed 20,000 riders and the remaining Janissaries in a simultaneous charge from multiple directions. The ground in front of the Gulyai Gorod became a swamp of blood and mud. Corpses piled so deep in front of certain wall sections that later attackers were forced to climb over them to reach the walls. By the end of the third day's cumulative fighting, roughly 6,000 of the Horde's warriors were dead. Russian casualties stood at approximately 800. Something had shifted inside the Gulyai Gorod. Soldiers who had entered the battle barely managing their fear were beginning to feel something they had not expected: confidence. They had been here for 3 days. They had seen the best the Horde could do. They were still standing. During the fourth and fifth days, Devlet accepted that frontal assaults were bleeding him white for nothing of military value. He ordered a complete encirclement. He would seal the Russians inside their wooden fortress and starve them out. The fatal flaw in this plan was the Pokra River, which fed directly into the Russian position from behind. The defenders had unlimited water and weeks of pre-stored food. They could wait indefinitely. The Horde could not. 120,000 men and horses consumed supplies at a rate the stripped countryside could not sustain. Foraging parties traveled further from the camp each day, and Cossack ambush parties were waiting for them in the forests, cutting them apart and vanishing before a response could form. Meanwhile, dysentery was tearing through the overcrowded Tartar camp. Hundreds fell ill every day. The unburied corpses from the battle days lay in the summer heat and made sanitary conditions worse with each sunrise. Vorotinsky did not sit still during the encirclement. He sent Cossack raiding parties of 200 to 300 men slipping through the Tartar lines in darkness. They cut sentries' throats in silence, set fire to tents, scattered horses, and disappeared before a coherent response could be organized. The effect on morale was far out of proportion to the physical damage. Warriors who spent their days attacking walls could not sleep at night without wondering whether they would wake up. On the fifth day, 3,000 fresh Russian musketeers slipped through the Tartar lines under cover of darkness, guided by Cossacks who knew every stream and forest path in the area. Their arrival sent a message to every man inside the Gulyai Gorod. Moscow had not abandoned them. The Tsar still believed in this. The sixth day brought the moment that truly broke the Crimean Horde as a military force. Before dawn, a heavy fog settled over the entire battlefield. Vorotinsky had been watching the weather pattern for days, waiting for exactly this. While visibility was near zero, 5,000 of Russia's best soldiers, Streltsy veterans, Don Cossacks, armored noble cavalry, slipped out through the Gulyai Gorod's gates in total silence, divided into 10 columns assigned to specific targets inside the Tartar camp. They moved through the fog like ghosts. Tartar sentries were killed before they could make a sound. Then the massacre began. Muskets discharged at point-blank range into tents packed with sleeping warriors. Half-dressed men stumbled out into chaos in the darkness, unable to find their weapons or understand what was happening around them. The fog turned the vast Tartar camp into a slaughterhouse of confusion. Tartars fired into the darkness at shapes they could not see and killed their own men. No formation could hold in those conditions. No countercharge could find its target. One Russian column reached the horse corrals. The guards were killed, the ropes were cut, and thousands of Tartar horses stampeded out across the open steppe, taking with them the mobility that was the Horde's very soul. A second column reached the supply train and put it to the torch. Flames climbed through the fog, a beacon of catastrophe visible from kilometers away. After 2 hours, Vorotinsky sounded the retreat. The 10 columns disengaged and marched back to the Gulyai Gorod carrying Tartar battle standards as trophies. When the fog lifted at noon, Devlet Giray surveyed the damage. Roughly 10,000 of his warriors lay dead, most killed in their sleep. Thousands of horses were gone across the steppe. The entire supply train was ashes. Russian losses in. The raid numbered fewer than 300 men. The dynamic of the battle had permanently reversed. The men who had been cornered behind wooden walls, defending against attack, had walked into the enemy's camp in the darkness and carved it apart. The siege was broken, not by relief from outside, not by negotiation or weather or the enemy's choice to withdraw, but by the courage and discipline of the men behind the walls. On the seventh and final day, Devlet faced a decision with no good options. He had spent too much blood, too much political capital, too much of his personal reputation to simply turn around and ride home. He ordered the assault he had been building toward 50,000 warriors from all directions simultaneously. Then the scouts rode in, dust columns to the north. A Russian relief force was approaching, 5,000 men under Prince Dmitry Korostinin, a commander known for an audacity that bordered on recklessness. Devlet faced a trap with no clean exit. If he committed everything to attacking the Gulyai Gorod, Korostinin's force would strike his exposed rear. If he divided his army to deal with both threats, he fatally weakened both efforts. He divided. 30,000 warriors stayed to maintain the encirclement of the fortress. The remaining 84,000 wheeled north to destroy the relief force before it could link up with Vorotinsky. This was precisely what the two Russian commanders had coordinated. Korostinin was never coming to shelter behind the Gulyai Gorod's walls. He was coming to be the hammer, while Vorotinsky served as the anvil, and the horde was the material to be crushed between them. Korostinin took his 5,000 men to a wooded hilltop with forest at his back and light cannons deployed on the slopes. He fought a brilliant retreating action, yielding ground slowly, making each Tartar charge cost lives it could not afford, leading the pursuit deliberately and without panic. At Molodi, Vorotinsky saw his window. With 30,000 Tartars trying to maintain an encirclement around his entire army, the ring was too thin to hold. He opened every gate of the Gulyai Gorod and sent his entire army pouring out in one overwhelming surge. 20,000 Russians struck the thinned Tartar encirclement at full momentum. It broke almost immediately. Vorotinsky left a rear guard at the fortress, took 15,000 men, and marched north. To complete the trap, when the two Russian armies joined in the mid-afternoon, Devlet found himself being struck simultaneously from two directions. His men had been in continuous combat for 7 days. Their horses were spent. Their supplies were ash. The confidence that had carried them north, the deep, generational conviction of the horde's invincibility, had been systematically destroyed over 7 days of fighting a wall that would not break. Devlet ordered a retreat. It was a rational military decision. What happened next was not rational. An army of 100,000 men in retreat, stripped of its belief in its own invincibility, does not retreat. It dissolves. The Russians pursued for kilometers without stopping. The Pokra River became a killing ground as thousands of Tartars tried to cross simultaneously, pushing each other beneath the water. Those who reached the opposite bank were cut down by musket fire from the pursuing columns. The forest that the retreating warriors had hoped would shelter them became a maze of death. Cossacks hunted through the trees with the patience and skill of men who had been hunted the same way for generations and had learned every technique from their pursuers. Devlet Giray, the Khan who had burned Moscow, fled with barely 6,000 of his personal guard. He abandoned his tent, his battle standards, his Ottoman artillery, the flags of a dozen Tartar clans, everything. He rode south without stopping until he was safe, and he did not look back. Of the 120,000 warriors who had ridden north in confident column toward a Russia they believed was already broken, fewer than 20,000 reached Crimea. Between 30 and 50,000 lay dead on the field and in the pursuit, with some estimates reaching higher. The Pokra River ran red for days. Wolves and carrion birds feasted for weeks. The stench forced the evacuation of villages within 15 kilometers of the battlefield. The loss rate was somewhere between 85 and 90%. This was not a defeat. It was an extermination. The echoes of 7 days on the Pokra River were heard from Constantinople to London, and the world they remade was a fundamentally different world than the one that had existed before them. Devlet Giray rode day and night back to Crimea, too frightened to pause. Cossack pursuit columns hunting his stragglers across the steppe for days behind him. He reached safety with 10 to 15,000 men. The Crimean Merces, the experienced warrior nobility that had formed the horde's fighting core, the men who had carried the traditions and the tactical knowledge of 3 centuries of steppe warfare, lay dead in the fields around Molodi. It would take generations to rebuild that kind of trained, experienced cavalry. By the time those generations had passed, the technological window that had made the nomadic warrior dominant on the battlefield would have closed forever. In Moscow, church bells rang continuously for days. Religious processions filled every street. 3 days of national celebration were proclaimed. Ivan ordered Thanksgiving services in every church across the country and declared the victory as proof of divine favor for his dynasty and his nation. Captured Tartar battle standards were hung in St. Basil's Cathedral as permanent trophies. Some of them remain in Russian museums to this day. Prince Vorotinsky was granted new lands and titles in recognition of the achievement. Common soldiers received cash bonuses, and in an unprecedented gesture, some of the serfs who had fought at Molodi were freed from serfdom entirely. In Constantinople, Sultan Selim II was furious. He ordered a full military inquiry into how his Janissaries and his artillery had been consumed by a wooden wall on the Russian steppe. The conclusion his advisors reached was deeply uncomfortable. The age of dominant nomadic cavalry was finished. Firearms and mobile fortification had permanently broken its power. Ottoman support for Devlet's continued ambitions was drastically curtailed, and the Khan received a letter from his imperial patron that amounted to a formal assignment of blame for the catastrophe. The great dream of Ottoman expansion to the Ural Mountains was quietly shelved and never revived. Across Eastern Europe, the political calculations shifted immediately. Poland and Lithuania, which had lived under the shadow of Tartar raids for centuries, began restructuring their border defense forces around firepower rather than heavy cavalry. Slave prices on the Black Sea markets rose sharply because the raids that had fed those markets for generations had nearly ceased. The human infrastructure of the Crimean Khanate's raiding capacity had been destroyed at Molodi. European embassies in Moscow changed their tone completely. Ivan was no longer the ruler of a peripheral and semi-barbaric eastern state. He was the Tsar who had broken the Horde, and his court was visited by ambassadors who now treated him as a serious peer. England dramatically expanded the Muscovy Company's trading operations, and English military observers arrived specifically to study the Gulyai Gorod and its tactical implications. Devlet attempted one more raid in 1573 with barely 15,000 men, a fraction of what he had commanded the year before. The Russians repelled it without needing the Gulyai Gorod. The old man died in 1577, his life's ambition buried in the mud of the Pokra River. In 1783, Catherine the Great annexed the Crimean Khanate outright, and the descendants of the conquerors became subjects of the empire they had NCE nearly destroyed. With the southern frontier finally secured in the aftermath of Molodi, Russia turned east, and in less than a century it had stretched its borders from Poland to the Pacific Ocean, creating the largest territorial empire the world had ever seen. Molodi is, in every meaningful sense, the battle in which Russia became a superpower. The Gulyai Gorod accomplished something that military theorists had struggled with for centuries. It shattered the fundamental trade-off between mobility and protection that every army before it had been forced to accept. Build a fortress and you surrender the ability to choose your battlefield. Field a mobile army and you accept vulnerability in open ground. The walking city gave its army both the ability to move to wherever the battle needed to be fought, and then the ability to stop and become impenetrable. Military historians of later centuries have noted the conceptual kinship with 20th century mechanized doctrine. Use mobility to reach a favorable position, then apply protection and firepower to destroy the enemy. The Gulyai Gorod did not spread across Western European warfare partly because of terrain. The mountains of Italy, the marshes of Flanders, the forests of Germany could not accommodate kilometer-long modular wall systems, and partly because Western armies did not face the specific threat that made it necessary. Russia continued developing and deploying improved versions for decades after Molodi. Eventually, better artillery made even the improved versions obsolete. But in its critical hour, in the summer of 1572, it was the difference between the existence and extinction of the Russian state. The legacy of Ivan the Terrible does not simplify itself because of Molodi. Ivan did not soften after the victory. If anything, the final decade of his reign grew darker and more erratic. In 1570, before Molodi, he had already sacked Novgorod, one of his own great cities, massacring between 3,000 and 60,000 civilians on the basis of suspected treason. In 1581, in a fit of uncontrolled rage during an argument, he struck and killed his own son Ivan, the heir he had spent decades grooming to succeed him. The period following his death in 1584, known as the Time of Troubles, nearly unraveled everything he had built, coming close to exactly the key end of catastrophe that Molodi had prevented. The chronicles kept writing about Molodi anyway, because Ivan had accomplished what no previous Russian ruler had managed. He had permanently closed the book on the Mongol era. He had freed Russia from the Horde. History's verdict on him is the verdict it must be: a deeply damaged man whose childhood trauma never healed, whose brilliance and cruelty were so intertwined as to be inseparable, who saved his nation and terrorized it simultaneously, whose legacy does not resolve into a simple moral judgment and was never intended to. For lessons from Molodi remain as clear today as they were in the summer of 1572. The first is innovation under pressure. Vorotinsky did not invent the Gulyai Gorod from nothing. He took an existing idea, the portable shield used at Kazan, and scaled it beyond anything anyone had previously imagined possible. In moments of genuine crisis, smart adaptation of what already exists often outperforms the search for an entirely original solution. The second is the imperative to change the terms of the fight. The Russians could not win on the Horde's terms. Their numbers were too small, their cavalry was not equal, and the open steppe was the enemy's home ground. Vorotinsky built a battlefield where the Horde's greatest strength became useless and Russia's advantages became decisive. When you cannot win the game being played, you build a different game. The third is that discipline is the weapon that technology only enables. The Gulyai Gorod was an engineering achievement. What made it lethal was soldiers who did not break when 120,000 riders charged their walls. Vorotinsky spent months not building a structure, but building a state of mind. The walls worked because the men behind them held. The fourth is the lesson of history's blind spots. Molodi permanently changed the balance of power in Eastern Europe and barely registered in the Western chronicles of its era. The most consequential events do not always happen where the historians are watching. Sometimes the world pivots in a field that no one has heard of, decided by men whose names will not appear in textbooks for centuries, if they appear at all. Return to the horizon. July of 1572. The dust rises in the south like a storm cloud. But now look at the same horizon in September of the same year. The dust is gone. The ground in front of the Pakra River is quiet in the way that only a battlefield is quiet after the dead have been lying in the sun for weeks. The Horde is gone. The 120,000 warriors who rode north in confident column have been reduced to a broken remnant, fleeing south across the steppe with Cossacks on their heels. For 240 years, the Russian people paid the tribute, surrendered their sons to be raised as strangers in foreign courts, and watched their cities burn under Mongol fire. For 240 years, they lived inside a fear so old and so complete that it had become the shape of the world itself, the permanent background condition of Russian existence. In 7 days of carnage on the Pakra River in the summer of 1572, that fear was killed. Not weakened, not pushed back, killed. The Horde that had haunted Eastern Europe since the age of Genghis Khan had come in its full strength, backed by Ottoman power and centuries of unconquered tradition, and it had been broken against a wall of Russian wood, Russian discipline, and Russian dead who refused to move. Molodi does not appear in Western textbooks. It has no major Hollywood production. It is absent from most survey courses in European history. The battle that decided whether Russia would continue to exist as a state is largely unknown outside of specialist scholarship. But to understand how a collection of frightened principalities, paying tribute to nomadic overlords and burning their own borders ahead of every raid, became an empire that eventually stretched from Poland to the Pacific, you must understand Molodi. The shadow that darkened Eastern Europe for nearly 3 centuries lifted here, in a river valley south of Moscow, behind a walking wall of wood and smoke, defended by 25,000 soldiers who stood their ground against 5 times their number and did not break. History pivoted here. The world that came after was built on this foundation. It is worth pausing to consider what the world looked like from Constantinople in the summer of 1572, because that perspective makes Molodi's significance even clearer. The Ottoman Empire at this moment was at the absolute peak of its power and reach. Under Suleiman the Magnificent and his successors, Ottoman armies had pushed into Hungary, besieged Vienna, dominated the Mediterranean, and established suzerainty over North Africa. The empire's Janissary Corps was widely regarded as the finest professional infantry on Earth. Ottoman engineering and logistics were the most sophisticated military system in the world. When the Sultan endorsed Devlet Giray's campaign, he was not making a speculative bet on a long shot. He was applying the full weight of a mature imperial system to the destruction of a state that he regarded, not unreasonably, as both vulnerable and strategically positioned to threaten Ottoman interests in the north. The defeat of 120,000 warriors, including 4,000 of his own Janissaries, by a force of 25,000 Russians behind wooden walls was not just a military reverse. It was a statement that the world had changed in ways that Istanbul had not anticipated. The speed with which that message was received and understood in Constantinople tells you something important about the quality of Ottoman strategic thinking at the time. Within months of receiving the reports from the Molodi campaign, Ottoman military planners were conducting the kind of honest institutional assessment that many great powers in defeat prefer to avoid. The conclusion that firearms and field fortification had permanently altered the calculus of steppe warfare was correct, and acting on it rather than dismissing it as a temporary setback reflects the intellectual seriousness that had built the Ottoman system in the first place. The tragedy is that the window for acting on it effectively had already closed. The steppe nomads' era of military dominance was not something that could be reversed by better planning or larger armies. It was over. If this story reached you, if this battle that history forgot felt like something worth remembering, then do something that costs you nothing and means a great deal to this channel. Hit the like button right now. Not because of an algorithm, though yes, that matters too. Do it because Mikhail Vorotinsky and the men who stood behind those walls at Molodi deserve more than obscurity. They deserve to be known. Subscribe if you are not already here, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. Because this is not the end of the story. The victory at Molodi opened a door. East of the Ural Mountains lay the greatest land mass on Earth. The vast emptiness of Siberia, populated by dozens of peoples, containing resources beyond calculation, and in less than a century Russia would cross it entirely. The men who made that possible were shaped by what happened at Molodi in the summer of 1572, when Russia learned that it could survive anything. That story is coming. Make sure you are here for it.